This is session 2 for Good Clash. My name is Meg Mott. I teach politics at Marlborough College. And the thing that makes me most happy is to talk about contentious issues with people who are willing to stretch and maybe cry, maybe feel indignant, maybe feel afraid, maybe feel ashamed, and still stay with the process. So, and given what we're about to start, we're doing one more preliminary talk today, but then we're going to go into some very, very difficult issues: abortions, guns, capital punishment, which people, good people, have different opinions about. And so how can we figure out ways to get into a good clash? And one other thing I wanted to remind people from last week, there was some great conversations. And I love it when people raise their hands and say, well, actually, I don't agree with what you're saying. Right? Good clash. And I think it was Steve who said, you're moving in a direction I don't quite understand. You're talking a lot about nations and nationalism. And that's a very legitimate question to say, why are we talking about this in the context of politics? The hope is that through good clash, this is quoting Machiavelli. I'm not dressed as Machiavelli today. I'm not quite sure who I am, but in a discussion prior to this, we thought, ooh, seems to be channeling French 18th century. I was hoping maybe Tocqueville was alive during some of that time. So if I'm channeling anybody today, it may be Alexis de Tocqueville. However, Machiavelli said, and Tocqueville would also agree, we have good clash because we want to make good laws. And abortion, guns, capital punishment, we need good policy. So we may not all agree with how the deliberation ends up. We think that the Supreme Court will settle all these issues for us. In fact, they start to set up the way we talk about it, and that's it's still up to us to try and figure out how to do this. So today we are going to look at what gets in the way of good clash. And I'll do a little bit of a reminder of what we covered, like the greatest moments of last week, greatest hits from the past, and then we're going to go on into the 21st century and compare what 21st century cognitive psychologists are saying and what my old guys, political theorists, would say. There's some interesting overlaps. They're getting at the same issues. It took, excuse me, but it took cognitive psychologists quite a long time to catch up to things that early modern political theorists had already figured out. However, that's okay. Every discipline has its learning curve. I get it. I teach political theory. Okay, so let's get started with a few of the highlights from last class. Aristotle begins, he's very optimistic about human nature. He believes that the more we do something, the better we get at it. So if we're doing something good, such as deliberation, we will become better deliberators. And he says, he doesn't say potluck, but he does actually reference a potluck. It is better for lots of people to bring food to a meal than for one person to design the whole meal out of their own purse. So here we've started with an idea that if we deliberate, if we engage in good clash, we will become better people and the food will be better. This is something I got from Lynn Martin, who came to the Putney talks on the Bill of Rights. And when we were talking about how necessary it was to think about different ways of holding disagreement, she told me about this great passage from P.D. James. Hey, Lynn, do you want to read this?
There are two easy options for any society: total prohibition, as in a totalitarian state, or total license. Both avoid the ardors of decision. Both have the attractions of certainty.
Yeah. And just to stop there for a moment, with a totalitarian state, we get certainty. Because whatever the dictator says, that's what it is. We also get that, says P.D. James, when there's total license. Because who cares? If everybody's just doing what they want to do, then we don't have to reach any decision. So both ways, we take decision making and we pass it off ourselves. The ardor, I love it, she says that.
The difficult option is to decide where the line should be drawn. And this, surely, is the responsibility of any civilized and democratic country.
And I'm going to lean heavily on those two words, civilized and democratic. Civilized, I know, gets a bad rap, particularly for good reasons. When anthropologists have made it very clear that a lot of civilizing efforts were actually colonialism. However, I'm going to go to the idea of civilized as understanding each person as having civil rights, as having civil obligations. And so civilized means that we understand each other as being part of our mix. And democratic means that if we're really doing a democracy, then we should be able to govern ourselves, which means we're going to need to make some difficult decisions. So civilized and democratic, those two terms are asking a lot of each other, of ourselves. We could just offshore, what do they say? You know, you have the offshore corporation. You could have a dictator, and then you don't have to make any decisions for yourself. Or you could say everybody gets to choose their own way, and then we don't have to make any common decisions. But this is the hard thing, which means we're going to have to talk about common interests again. Yippee! It's a scary trip. This is from Homer. Anybody know who those two creatures are?
Scylla and Charybdis.
Scylla and Charybdis. So which one is Scylla? The Scylla is the monster with that, right. And Charybdis is the whirlpool. So I don't know, is the totalitarian guy the Scylla? And the whirlpool is total license? But we have to somehow go through it. And I love Homer because, you know, Odysseus is there, and he knows he has to go through this, and he knows he's going to have a very difficult time not to go one way or the other. And they need to somehow design a course through knowing that it could get very, very bad. And they still make that effort. So that's pretty much what we're doing. We're saying we're going to go through this passage together, knowing it's a scary trip, knowing everything could fall apart, and we're trying our very darndest to be able to negotiate it. I can't remember. Is this when Odysseus was bound to the mast as well and had his ears? No. Sirens. Thank you. This is why I need you all. Thank you. So how did he figure out how to make sure he could get through? Was it just determination? He didn't do this. Well, what made, I know, this is an open question. I don't have the answer. Why do you think he decides to do this and he doesn't turn back? He's trying to get home. So maybe that's what we're thinking about when we think about good clash. We're trying to get home. We're trying to figure out how to make these decisions because we need to get home. I could go to this and get all sorts of romantic feelings, but I do want to remind us about Hobbes, who says, don't get too ahead of yourself. There's reasons to think that this whole effort is not actually going to be glorious. And does somebody want to read this?
Once a decision is reached, deliberators have fewer options.
So once we really choose something, and I'll tell you, my guess is we will never, and I hope I haven't disheartened people, but my guess is that in some way, the reason why we can't reach a decision in the United States on abortion, guns, and capital punishment is that we can't bear reducing options on this issue. I'm just throwing that out as a possibility. There are many things like road work that we can say, all right, we're going to choose to pave the road. Oh my goodness, that's a very hard decision. And there's going to be lots of reasons why we should never pave these roads. But that's a decision that actually we could say, all right, end of story. I lived on a dirt road in Halifax, we paved it, end of story. Now it's a paved road. But these other issues are going to be very, very hard. So we may deliberate and we may not actually reach conclusions. This is the thing about Hobbes. He's always like, we're ready. We're democracy, yes. Civilized, yes. We're going to come together. We're going to make a great decision. Everything is going to be fantastic. Whoopee! And then Hobbes says, not necessarily. And I think Myra last week said Brexit. And maybe, you know, I'm not going to assume that everybody here is thinking that Brexit was a problem, but aren't we watching a country having a very, very hard time with a massive democratic effort that then ended in a vote that was not, in many people's minds, more reasonable or wise? So yes, we want to get home, and it may not be great. So Hobbes says, Myra, can I ask you?
It is merely the last appetite or aversion immediately adhering to the action or to the omission thereof.
And aren't we so aware, particularly now, how time figures into our decision making? We can think about an election and go to certain dates that happened before the 2016 election. And because of something that happened in the news, certain appetites happened. Other appetites didn't happen. And so decisions were made not because of the wisdom that Aristotle promises us, but because that's just how it went down. It was a timing thing, not a reason thing. So that's the sad news. But we don't have to just hold on to Hobbes. We've got a full cast of characters here. Oh, maybe Mill would be my person I'm holding on to. Reasons to persevere. We may be wrong. So why do we engage in deliberation and talk to people who we don't agree with? Because we may be wrong. And that's a very important piece. And here's another good reason. And these are all very self-serving. Although I know, and this is going to be today's talk, it's not necessarily self-serving to feel wrong. I hate feeling wrong. This is that whole professor thing, right? Oh, she's got a PhD. Oh, she's a professor at Marlborough College. Therefore, she must be saying all sorts of great things. I'm going to make mistakes today, and I may have typos on my PowerPoint slides. I will be very flawed. And if you see the mistakes, please let me know. Or if I say something you think is wrong, please let me know. So I'm going to tell you, I'm going to want to find it in my self-interest to be wrong. But I don't have that all the time. If my partner tells me I'm wrong, I'm oftentimes like, why do you have to tell me that? And here's the one that's the hardest. The two sides share the truth between them. We had a lot of conversations about that last time. What does that mean? There was somebody over there, I can't remember if it was Howard or maybe it was Wesley, who said, was it you, Wesley? Did you comment that you said to share the truth between you is not a median point, it's not a compromise point, it's more of a...
Okay, I agree with it. It was Howard.
It was Howard. Howard says he didn't say it. There was some wisdom, yes. But Wesley, do you want to expound on this?
Well, just that the truth has got to be something that not just two people, but all people approach. But does anybody possess it?
So did everybody hear Wesley says the truth is something that not just two people, but all people need to approach. And then he asks the question, does anybody possess it? And that's a lot of I feel, the sentiment behind Mill in saying that there is a shared truth. Nobody possesses it. It's common. Ooh, we're back to that. It's a common, collective thing that we own. Well, or
they share
David.
a compromise of the truth.
David is saying that maybe they share a compromise of the truth or a portion. So we need the different parts in order to hold on to it. Yeah, behind David. I don't know your name. Charlie.
And perhaps the image of a vesica Pisces would describe our situation.
Can you say that again and explain that term?
A vesica Pisces, it would be, imagine a circle
Yeah.
and another circle. Now, if the perimeter of one circle passes through the center of the other circle, then we create a shape like a fish. I mean, this is very strong in Christian symbology, the vesica Pisces. And we are each, the truth is found in the vesica Pisces, not necessarily in our own individual circles.
So Charlie is talking about something called the vesica Pisces, and now I'm going to have to go and look for that. Maybe I'll find some sort of image about this. Something that comes out of the Christian tradition, in which the drawing itself shows how parts and whole formulate together, and
Right, two circles, but they intersect and they create.
do we call that a Venn diagram, Charlie? Okay, and we can have that. Yes, Susan wants to jump in.
But in this context, we probably are talking about a 3D Venn.
Right.
There are so many points of view and so many
So yeah.
experiences.
But we're struggling to try and find some sort of ideas on what this third point might look like. And it makes sense that we're going to go for different kind of images to understand it. In the interest of time, sorry, Thad, I'm going to keep going forward, but I will make sure that we have time to stop and do more Q&A. So I also wanted to highlight these two thinkers that we talked about last time, who are also trying to understand, what does this look like, that the truth is shared, not owned, an attitude. So this is a disposition. Somebody want to read Mill?
Every opinion ought to be considered precious, with whatever amount of error and confusion and truth may be blended.
Yeah. So we have something of error. I may be wrong. Confusion. I'm feeling so mad right now. I want my head to explode, but really I'd rather your head exploded. And the truth is also going to be part of that. So this truth is this big, big term, and we have all these different feelings, but we're going to try and have a disposition to treat the other opinion as precious.
What's the meaning of precious?
And can you tell me your name?
Joel.
Joel is asking, what is the meaning of precious? Any efforts? Any reasons? Great. Janet.
Valuable?
Valuable. Precious is valuable. Yeah. Worth our attention. And then Jane Addams. Would somebody like to read Jane Addams?
The emancipation of one faction has to be inclusive of another faction, or it will encounter many failures, cruelties, and reactions.
Thank you. And this is where this idea of faction becomes important. Okay, James Madison. Maybe I'm trying to bring in James Madison here. That a faction is something that could either be a majority group, it could be a minority group. But it's a group of people who want what they want, and which is adverse to the civil rights of others or to the common interest. So we know factions. We're probably members of factions. I know when I'm wanting something done, I'm going to look for a faction, and I'm going to try and get my faction in charge, and we're going to make sure it happens. For me, this was what I did in the early 90s as part of the Battered Women's Movement, and I wanted the Violence Against Women's Act passed, and I was gung-ho for prosecution, and I did that, and I stood behind it, and I spoke out against anybody who said that that was not the right approach. We needed the state to make women and children safe. I have since changed my mind, and I now see the problems. That's why I went back to school with taking a factional approach and trying to solve it with a factional approach. And I may talk more about this as we go down, but that for me was the big illumination, that having a strong law doesn't necessarily solve the underlying problems. So, and when we were pushing for this, we did not want to talk to anybody who didn't share our viewpoints. We're unwilling, and it's pretty interesting. Much of the pushback against the Violence Against Women Act came from people like bell hooks or other people from marginalized communities who said, if you do a law and order approach to this, you're not helping our communities. And we didn't want to hear it because we thought we had the keys to power, and we got the keys to power. We being the battered women's movement. Those were the things we looked at last week.
Right.
Yes.
Let me add one thing to me that was important last week.
Yeah.
And that was the ultimate decision maker. I'll give an example. In the 1950s, I was involved in 5 cases that became legal. 4 went to the Supreme Court, and we won. Now, one of them was the international air raid drill on Mexico, United States, and Canada. And this, by law, everyone had to take shelter. A group of us went to jail in Manhattan instead of taking shelter. But that legal case went to the Supreme Court, and the whole system of international air raid drills was thrown out.
Wow. And can you remind me your name? I'm sorry, Sheldon? Sheldon?
Yeah.
Okay. As soon as I asked, I remembered. So Sheldon is reminding us another piece that was very important we talked about last time, and that is who is the ultimate decision maker. And this got to this point where we're trying to say, we have a democracy, but we have a certain kind of democracy. So are we truly decision makers? Who is making the decision? We may not be a monarchy, but there is an institution that tends to make the big decision. And we were talking about that in terms of Hobbes. Shoshana said, you know, Hobbes, he's going to support dictators. I said, well, maybe not dictators. But there is an element where Hobbes is wanting us to see who is the ultimate dictator. And as Sheldon is reminding us, we do have an authority who's the ultimate dictator, and that is the Supreme Court. Because all of our decisions go through the Supreme Court. When we love the Supreme Court decisions, as Sheldon is suggesting, getting rid of the international air raid law, and some people went to jail in order to protest that law, if I'm hearing you correctly, that the Supreme Court resolved that issue towards liberty, if we think that what they were doing was right. And this is one of our places where we need to be thinking about how much decision-making we are willing to give to the Supreme Court in this country. We give an awful lot of decisions to the Supreme Court. That a quick thing? Otherwise, I'm going to keep going.
Quick, I don't know how many people follow news as closely as I do on the Supreme Court, and that is that they're bringing up the same thing that happened with Roosevelt, and that they're thinking about changing the amount of people on the Supreme Court.
Yeah.
Yeah, so Thad is reminding us that as Roosevelt did, because Roosevelt was having a terrible time with the Supreme Court, they were wanting to pass all sorts of labor legislation that improved the conditions of women and children, and then eventually all workers in America. And the Supreme Court refused to do what Roosevelt wanted, so there was the pack the court strategy, and that's being talked about again, which is change the number from 9. Roosevelt wanted 13. I don't know what people are talking about now. Okay, so it's good to have this background, because now let's turn to how current democratic theorists, this is Amy Gutman and Dennis Thompson, suggest that we engage in deliberation. So what are some of the pieces that we need in order to have good deliberation? Reasons must be given. So that seems good. As long as everybody knows why we want to pave the road, that seems like we could make a decision about it. But then I'm just going to go through what they say. Accessible information must be provided. This we get every time a town meeting happens. Everybody should know when they come to town meeting what it is you're going to be deciding. The articles should have been posted. There should be reports in the town meeting to help you make decisions. During the deliberation of town meeting, people get to ask the select board or the school board, why did you do this? And the information is given to the people. The decisions must be binding, so that when people come to make a decision, there's an understanding that the vote actually counts. We see that at all our town meetings. The yeas, it appears the yeas have it. That's what I say. The yeas have it. Article 3 is passed. That's how a good deliberation should work. And the process must be dynamic. Always understanding that if people don't like something that was decided in town meeting of 2019, when it comes to 2020, people may make another article. So this is your basic ground rules. It makes it sound so easy, right? As long as we have all the reasons and the accessible information and we know that it counts, and the process must be dynamic, it all seems like, okay, this is all fine. And I think I heard Myra saying, all we have to do is think about Brexit. And exactly. And then it begins to seem like, whoa, is this enough? Is this too naive? Staying with this idea, here's a group of people, and we don't even have to think about Brexit. We could think about Act 46. This is a group of people getting together and wanting to talk about Act 46. And the reasons that we do this and have all these conversations, these are good basic political principles. When you have deliberation, when you have good clash, it promotes legitimacy of collective decisions. That makes sense, right? The idea was you get people talking about it, the decision will be embraced. It encourages public-spirited perspectives on public issues. So having these conversations, like Aristotle said, makes us better citizens. It promotes mutually respective processes of decision-making, and it should help correct mistakes. So that's that dynamic process. All of this happens a lot. So we're talking about hard issues. It may not happen quite so well, but towns basically operate under these principles in Vermont and in New Hampshire as well, right? There's town meeting in New Hampshire. In Western Massachusetts, is there town meeting? Yeah, yeah. So a lot of municipalities use this very, very effectively. However, sometimes it just doesn't work. A decision is made, whether it's Brexit, or I know there's a lot of strong feelings around Act 46, where instead of feeling as if we've reached a common ground, instead of feeling like we've come home, we feel completely at sea. And how are we going to make sense of that? Because that phenomenon is easily reproduced. Give people a really, really hard thing to decide, and there is no sense of resolution. It just feels like, who am I living next to? How can you say that? That makes no sense to me. So one way of making sense of the human psyche, because that's what we're getting at, comes from Frantz Fanon, who is a psychologist. Also, he's considered part of the political theory canon. We always put smart people who say smart things in our canon. Oh, you're great. Come over here, please. You're one of us. Can somebody read Frantz Fanon's?
Sometimes people hold a core belief that is very strong. When they are presented with the evidence that works against that belief, the new evidence cannot be accepted. It would create a feeling that is extremely uncomfortable, called cognitive dissonance. And because it is so important to protect the core belief, they will rationalize, ignore, and even deny anything that doesn't fit with the core belief.
Thank you, Mary.
Like the flat earth.
What?
Like the flat earth.
David says like the flat earth, right. I mean, we could think of an entire time when it had to be flat. And when it is a core belief, that usually means a feeling about ourselves. And in thinking about Act 46, why that one has felt so big in Vermont, a lot of people, when they're thinking about themselves as caring for children, have really strong core beliefs about what that should look like. And if other people have different ideas about how it's best to care for children, that can turn into cognitive dissonance. I'm suggesting that. And maybe let me take an easier example. I like to think of myself as a safe driver. I always follow the rules. I'm not one of those people that drives a big car that's over muscular and that pushes people out of the way and speeds down the highway. That's not me. No, no, no. I am a safe driver. Well, somehow, in the last 2 weeks, when I was trying to come to an event in which I needed to be there early because I was the presenter, I don't know how it happened, but 85 miles an hour on 91. But that's not me, people. That is not me. I am a very safe driver. How that happened, that was just a matter of circumstances. I was not going to feel the shame of being late for this event. No, 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 no. I was just going to make sure I got there on time. And oh well, over 85. I don't know how it happened, but I'm a very, very safe driver. So that's a little bit how this works. The state of cognitive dissonance comes into play when two ideas are psychologically inconsistent. I am such a safe driver. Anybody could get a ride with me. You'd be so happy. My little fit. We're so modest, so well behaved. Because the pain of cognitive dissonance is eased by self-justification, I will keep telling you that there were good reasons why I had to drive 85 on 91. And I hope nobody reports me because I'm really not telling you the truth right now. This is just for an example, officer. So that I'm going to have this terrible pain, I'm going to keep telling you and myself that I am a safe driver because otherwise I might not get back in my car if I really looked at my behavior sometimes. So here's a little picture to show us. If you have two options and one is unpleasant truths and the other is comforting lies, most of us, most of the time, are going to go with comforting lies because it's just so much more pleasant. This came to my attention thanks to a book that Amr Latif loaned to me, and I know some of you are friends and enjoy Amr's talks. Mistakes were made, but not by me. I highly recommend it. They just came out with a new edition in which they include a final chapter that actually gives some suggestions on how to go forward. So that this is the first edition shown here. I'd go for the second edition. But here is why we engage in this self-justification, because it preserves our beliefs. I have to feel good about myself as a driver. So I go through this little that was just those times. That was just necessary. It increases confidence in our decisions. And here we go back to decision making is incredibly stressful, especially when it's about big, big issues. So if we engage in self-justification, we're going to feel better. It enhances self-esteem and well-being. It's like listening to VPR classical. It's great. It just calms you right down. You feel good about yourself. You feel happy about the world. Self-justification does an awful lot for us. But here's the problem. Self-justification harms us because it erases our mistakes. I just don't even have to think about that day. Were I not giving this talk today, I would not be telling you about my moments on 91 speeding down the highway. Because otherwise, I know myself. I would just say, oh, that was just that time. Take it away. Take it away. It's not in my brain anymore. And I think we all know that when we really face our mistakes, we actually learn, we become smarter, we become more aware of ourselves. And if this reiterative process of building something, measuring it, learning it, we can't learn if we've knocked out the measurement. So if we're not really measuring ourselves, honestly, we're not really learning. But we can go back to building. In fact, I guess maybe I mentioned this. F. Scott Fitzgerald said in America there are no second acts. So I gather, and there's people here who know much more about theater than I do, the first act is when you build. Second act is when you measure. The third act is when you learn. And Fitzgerald says, well, the United States, we're not very good at that second act. So because of this, either American or cognitive human issue, instead of a potluck where people are all coming together, too often our encounters turn into a deadlock where not only do we not want to hear what other people have to say, because, in which we don't want to hear what other people have to say because we don't want the cognitive dissonance, which may be how a lot of our partisan conversations are going right now. So I said this is going to be a somewhat hard class because we're dealing with hard issues. So I thought I might put one of the hardest pieces in recent history that could create cognitive dissonance in front of us and that we could wrestle with it. It's older. It's sometimes easier to do this for things that happened 10, 15 years ago, but when we still hold on to it, it's going to bring up those hard feelings. It's just the way it works. So this book that I mentioned, Mistakes Were Made But Not by Me, was originally, I think, published in 2007, and it starts with George Bush's decision to go to Iraq. And a lot of the book in the beginning is about that decision and the idea that a nation made a terrible mistake, and are we really willing to look at it and learn from it? So if we look at the 2003 invasion of Iraq, it did create a lot of cognitive dissonance. And how it played out, this is again from Tavris and Aronson's book, Mistakes Were Made, is pretty interesting. Somebody want to read this?
When no weapons of mass destruction were found, Democrats and Republicans who supported the invasion experienced cognitive dissonance.
Right. So we start with, and can you remind me your name?
Nancy.
Nancy, thank you. So when we started with when people deliberate, they need good information, and they need to have accessible information, and reasonable reasons must be given. We weren't operating with that. I think that's pretty well recognized by this point. So all of a sudden, these things that were supposed to be there were not there, and many people who voted for it, and there were many Democrats in the Senate who voted for it, experienced cognitive dissonance. There was also a Republican, Lincoln Chafee, I think, from Rhode Island, who did not vote for the invasion. So this did not go strictly down party lines, although somewhat down party lines in the Senate. So there was two different responses. Republicans refused to believe the evidence, and Democrats forgot they were ever in favor of the war. Right? Cognitive dissonance, two different ways of dealing with it. Deny the evidence, forgot you ever did it. Erase the mistake. So here we see self-justification happening on a grand scale. Before the war, 72% of Democrats said they believed that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. Now that's Democrats in general. After the war, only 26 believed that they had ever thought this way. They just erased the mistake. So one of the suggestions that are made by cognitive psychologists, how do you deal with this situation? It's pretty simple. Stay with the mistake. Really hang out there. But look at that poor guy. It's not easy. It's a tough thing to really stay with our mistakes. And trying to have those feelings by yourself or confront it with other people who will maybe remind you that you felt that way can be very difficult. Personally, I have come to think that we are still living out, we have the trauma of 9/11, which has gotten us very excitable. PTSD, I would say, on a global level. And then we have the fallout of this cognitive dissonance still playing out in our politics. So that it's too hard to stay with some of these mistakes. And for that reason, rather than go and talk to other people who may tell us about how our mistakes, because this is a big one. the invasion of Iraq on so many different levels. We are moving into echo chambers. Because when the mistake is too big for us to comprehend, we are going to look for people who think the same way we think. We're going to look for media who reinforces the fact that it wasn't us who made some mistakes. And can you see this screen enough? So here's this person, you, that's at the top, the orange person. And that person is, let's see, their ideas grow in strength. So there on the right is that arrow that's going down. Their ideas get stronger as long as they're talking to people who agree with them. And then the little arrow coming up from that right-hand group says, your sense of who you are then gains in strength. So the ideas get stronger from who you hang out with, and then your sense of who you are gets stronger and comes back to you. On the other side, you have media, which also, media is repeating continuously these ideas, and then you gain in strength. Again, I must have the right ideas because of what I'm listening to on the news. And the community, your friends who share your worldview, are also generating ideas that then go into the media. So we start to see how there's this feedback cycle. And at the bottom, those red lines are ideas that don't agree with yours. And if you have an echo chamber, then you are able to prevent a lot of unpleasant truths or inconvenient lies or whatever you want to call it, by just staying within your own realm. And I don't.
Call it the Trump chamber.
You call it the what chamber?
Trump.
So and Sheldon, where would you put Trump on the?
Well, he's right there.
So he is also. I mean, in some ways, this is a great object lesson. That in fact, what is being reported happening in the White House in terms of a feedback cycle, and that pushing away any ideas that don't fit, we can see that would be one way to analyze what's happening in the White House. I'd also say that we're also doing it here. I want to stay with the ideas of cognitive dissonance, and we're going to get into some more details after we take a break, but I'm curious what others think here in terms of where else do we see echo chambers besides Sheldon says the White House. Families can be echo chambers. Yeah, Steve.
I just wanted to ask, what does stay with mean to you?
Stay with mistake.
What does stay with mean?
Yeah. So did everybody hear that? Steve is asking, what does it mean to stay with the mistake? Own it. And so, can you say more about that? And is your name David?
My name is Charles.
Charles. Okay, sorry.
No, I can't say anything more about it, and that's just my understanding of what it means.
Yeah.
Stay with the mistake, own it. But I wouldn't want that boy to own that mistake.
Yeah.
I would want him to be able to see where the error was and change his behavior.
Yeah.
Or understand.
So Charles is saying to stay with the mistake is to own it, but not to get stuck right where that little child is. To be able to see the mistake and learn from it and then be able to do something else. So that's one way of thinking about staying with the mistake. Yes?
I think common parlance would be double down.
Double down. And are you Charlie?
Yeah.
Yeah, Charlie. So to double down on the mistake. Well, what does that mean, Charlie?
Well, when Trump says, for example, something that's an outright lie, he never says, "You're right, I lied." Mm-hmm. He just goes further with the lie.
Mm-hmm. So we're having lots of examples of not doing that, and Charlie's example was from the Trump administration, or Trump in particular. In the back, did you have your hand up? Can you say your name?
I'm Sue.
Sue.
I was just thinking to sit with it, but not necessarily be shamed by it.
Sue is saying to sit with it and not be shamed by it, which feels really important too. So this little guy is looking pretty sad. Do you remember how last week we also, Janice, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, but go ahead.
Go ahead.
For me, I'm thinking if any change is going to happen, you have to integrate that understanding in yourself. It's not enough to say, oh, I'm wrong. You have to, I would need to, like here, I would need to understand where I went wrong and why, and talk about it. Because for me, verbalizing helps to integrate the understanding and the acceptance of that.
Yeah, so Janice is talking about integrating, not just stay. I mean, that's a pretty bleak picture that I found. But so then the person would stand back, and then we'd have that person going through some sort of integrative process. People in restorative justice talk about the difference between punitive shame and reintegrative shame. And that is going to need to be social, reintegrating back into society, not being isolated in your mistake, but being shown ways that you can come together. And Janice was talking about that. It really requires a lot of processing. But this could be a social piece as well. So, yeah, Thad, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, as a mental health worker for more than 35 years, I've always seemed to have to apply sometimes 2 or 3 times a day what I learned in Gestalt therapy, which is you have permission to feel. And quite often people are in that level of not wanting to feel that they're going to learn from the mistake, so they keep repeating it. I've seen it physically. I've seen nurses who are really in a rush to get that stretcher in and get that person out of there. And they are in such a rush. They've got the doctor doing this, that, whatever. They keep trying to push the stretcher into the room when there's stuff in the way. Yours truly thinks to himself, boy, I don't want to be in the parking lot when they try to leave. But it's denial. It's like, I want that thing out of the way. I've got to get in there.
So Thad is talking about particularly nurses who are in emergency situations and who are just need to get this stretcher in, need to get things here, and having a hard time just being able to stop with the feelings. And that's what is going to keep coming up. If we have these feelings that isolate us, then we're not going to learn from the mistakes. One of the pieces that I want to just throw in terms of what does it mean to stay with? Well, Jane Addams said, look for the human detail. And what people in this book were also talking about is talk about the incident. And don't just talk about the incident as a mistake. Talk about it as actions. So if you stop and you say, okay, we're going to look at this a little bit more objectively. We're going to say, what happened before the incident? What happened after the incident? These are ways that the brain, and psychologists here in the room may have some things to offer to this, but this is something that has been shown is if you can bring it to the concrete and start to look at the actual actions, what was happening before, what was happening after, then begin to think who else was involved, what would the other people in the room have to say? So with Thad's example, a nurse might say, oh, I wonder what the doctor would have to say about this situation. Maybe that would make me stop pushing. Or what would somebody else in the room have to say about the situation in order to reduce the panic? So that staying with the mistakes can actually be a creative moment where you begin to look at the actors. We were talking last time about theater. How can we use theater to create the stage, reposition the people there, let the people, all the actors have that rich internal life. Remember last time I was raving about Shoshana on the stage? I'm sure there's other actors here. But a really good actor knows how to have a rich inner life shown. And when we can see that rich inner life in all the different actors, just as Jane Addams did with the Pullman strike, we're going to be able to integrate it on a different level. So that's kind of the idea. Yes? Are you a Charlie too?
No, I'm a Joel.
You're a Joel. I'm sorry, Joel. Yeah, you're still Joel.
I'm still having trouble with the way we're talking about mistake. They're mistakes of fact. For example, that Iraq did not possess weapons of mass destruction. Saddam Hussein was not responsible for 9/11. Barack Obama is not a Muslim king. Right? And
can people hear Joel's list? Okay, so I'm just going to, just so that people hear, the mistakes of fact, such as there were no weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, Saddam Hussein was not responsible for 9/11, and Barack Hussein Obama is not a Muslim, born in Kenya. Yes.
It seems to me that a lot of people, when confronted with their error, can make that accommodation, and do. Lots don't, but lots do. And I think with respect to Iraq, lots of people who believed that this was the case came to acknowledge that it was not. There's a whole different kind of mistake, which creates a much more complicated, it seems to me, notion of cognitive dissonance, which have to do with mistakes of judgment, which are not simply about facts, right? To take the Iraq example, there are people who believe that America had or has the right to invade countries and overthrow their governments. And that it is our obligation to bring democracy and so on. Those are more complicated. And the dissonance there, I think people cling to those kinds of beliefs in a much different kind of way than they cling to the factual judgments.
Right. So Joel is talking about these mistakes of judgment, and that these mistakes of judgment have so much to do with not just were there weapons of mass destruction or not, they have to do with what is America's role in the global political framework. Just as I have a certain picture of myself as a safe driver, which may not be realistic, America has had a picture of itself as, some people say, the policeman of the world or the bringer of democracy to everybody else. And it is that self-image that's creating the really strong cognitive dissonance. And I think that this is where we're actually getting to the point where we're seeing this cognitive dissonance about strong beliefs about who we are as a nation, and then getting information that suggests we may not be what we think we are, and that's creating enormous cognitive dissonance. So I'm going to take one more question or comment from Edie, and then we'll take a break.
So many people were killed, they don't talk about that.
And Edie is saying there are so many people who were killed.
You could watch the war right on TV.
Yeah.
The bombs coming down.
Right. And talk about a mistake. This is the thing in this world now. We are being shown the effects of the harm we are doing. And that creates enormous shame, I'm going to guess, and also fear. And that is going to increase our need to find somebody else to blame. So we're going to take a little break and then come back to this. Yeah, and I know it's very, very hard work. All right, welcome back, everybody. Remember how I told you I was going to make a mistake? It was going to be a typo. Thank you, Janet. I was able to correct. We inserted the than, because before it was rather than focus. These are the kind of mistakes we can live with. But maybe we do a little bit of these very public admission of error, and then these other ones might be a little easier to do. Especially if we follow Aristotle, the more we do it, the better we get. We develop habits. So I'm going to take us through a few more cognitive psychology insights about human beings and how when we have a tough issue, how our brains work. We may notice it in other people. We may notice it in the White House. We may notice it in foreign leaders. And the trick is to try and see it in ourselves. And also, Susan Hesse said something during the break that is very helpful. We talked about the Venn diagram, and Susan said we need to think about it on a three-dimensional level, because that's the reiterative process. That's the self-reflection piece. So yes, we may be able to look at other groups and see how they behave, and the trick is to turn it into 3 dimensions and start to reflect on ourselves as well. So this again is from this lovely book. In 1958, they did an experiment, the way social psychologists do experiments. You bring in people, you give them information, and then you see how they behave. So this was an experiment on desegregation at a time when that was a hot button issue. Brown versus Board of Education had happened fairly recently. So in 1958, social psychologists did this experiment, and after they gave them arguments on both sides of the debate, each side tended to remember the plausible arguments agreeing with their own position. Again, memory is crucial to understanding this third dimension. And the implausible arguments agreeing with the opposing position. So our brains will capture very, very good arguments that we already agree with, and our brains will forget very good arguments that don't fit our worldview. As Joel said, our judgments. Each side forgot the implausible arguments for their view and the plausible arguments for the opposition. So here's the information. It's great to do a debate, right? Have you ever been told to do a debate and then you have to do it for your opponent? That exercise, which they used to teach regularly, I think they got rid of some of these important civic lessons in high school. But that exercise and being able to give the good arguments for the opposing viewpoint is exactly the kind of habits we want to build. And Sue, over the break, told me about something in the Washington Post that was March 31st. College students organized civil discussions. So I think that the country as a whole is recognizing these skills need to be developed, because left to our own devices, this is what we get. Go human brain. Which means we will always be focusing on the mistakes of others. Dissonance theory predicts that we will conveniently forget good arguments made by an opponent, just as we forget foolish arguments made by our own side. And maybe you've seen that happen. Particularly, it's going to be contentious again for the 2020 election, I'm guessing. And that if you decide to go outside the echo chamber, are you actually looking for a good argument, or are you looking for arguments to belittle your opponent? So that's a challenge. It takes a little courage to do that. A more recent experiment was done by social psychologists that looked at the death penalty, and that'll be important for us when we come to talk about it. Again, get a sample. People have differing opinions. This group was given 2 scholarly articles, and one was in favor, and the other was opposed. And when I mean scholarly, they presented evidence about deterrence. Does capital punishment deter? Does it not deter? So people did providing some, and Joel wants us to pay attention to the difference between mistakes of facts and mistakes of judgment. But here were some social scientists who were looking at the data. If the readers were thinking rationally, says Tavris and Aronson, wouldn't they have moved to the middle? Wouldn't they have been able to hold both points of view? Might make sense as a deterrent, might not make sense as a deterrent. But they didn't move to the middle. Even though they had information about is it a deterrent, is it not, they didn't. Not only did each side try to discredit the other's argument, they also became more committed to their own side. So getting information that disagreed with their basic judgment reinforced the judgment. They call this the backfire effect. And it's interesting how cognitive dissonance and backfire effect, you can find this on many NPR stations, discussions of social scientists talking about this, because I think a lot of people are trying to make sense of a world where it's clear we need to do something, but it's clear that a lot of people aren't looking at the same facts in the same way.
The middle would have to be half killed.
The middle would have to be half killed, says David. What does that mean, David?
Well, when you get the death penalty,
yeah,
you either accomplish it or you don't.
Yes, so David has just said, when it comes to the death penalty, what do you do in the middle for death penalty? And in fact, half killed doesn't work. And this is why it's such a big issue, as is abortion and as are guns. These are life and death issues, and so it's going to be, whoa, which way are we going to go? And there is no middle way for that one. So there's two hands up over here. Can you tell us your name? Diane.
So I would suggest the same thing for the war, to go back to the Iraq War.
Yeah.
If you're opposed to war, listen to I'm not saying not to be disrespectful and to listen to people why they may think that was justified.
Yeah.
But there are times in the issues that you're going to stay where you are because you just, in theory, you may feel like war is a bad thing.
Yes.
So I may listen to people at that time who felt like it was justified, whether it was based on the falsity about the weapons of mass destruction or Al-Qaeda or whatever. But I wouldn't plan to be moved by that because I don't feel like war is justified. So there do seem to be, as you suggest also, in the three topics we're going to discuss,
right.
I mean, there will be some rigidity on that because...
Right. So Diane, in talking about the Iraq War, and if you have a very strong feeling that all war is wrong, then even though you may hear things from the other side, that's not going to change your basic judgment, your basic core belief. So how can you get a middle ground on something like an invasion of Iraq? And absolutely right. So many of these things, how can we even find a middle ground? I hope people realize that we're moving into difficult water, and there won't be this moment in week 5 where you say, oh great, the world's fine. No. It's more like, oh, how do we actually really wrestle with this? I'm going to keep pushing some of these slides, and then we can open it up. And just to get some more data to reflect back how Americans have started to move further and further out to the two edges. So if in 1994, most people seem to put themselves in the middle and identify strongly in the middle, by 2004, it was still strong in the middle. So that's kind of interesting. That's after 2001. That's even after the Iraq invasion. There's still a sense of Americans, if you trust the Pew Research Center, that many people find themselves in this middle position, who can conceive of a liberal and a conservative argument for any issue. May not always vote that way, but can conceive those two positions. Yeah, Wesley.
I just want to know what liberal and conservative views are.
So
help me to understand this.
So I should actually have said, so a liberal position would be one that is progressive to the left, tends to go with the Democratic Party. Conservative, being to the right, tends to go with the Republican Party. Does that begin to help, or what is the confusion, Wesley?
My confusion is that these terms are being trafficked in a way that's not helpful to me or to other people who are just as confused about the body politic as I am. Mm-hmm. That is, I know guys from my truck driving days who believe that they're conservative, and other guys maybe who think that I'm a liberal. And yet, neither one of those things is even remotely right. I mean, you're starting with political theory.
Right.
We have people on the radio right this morning while we're here who are throwing these terms around at one another and dividing all of us according to those terms. Right. And it's not helpful. Mm-hmm. And I'm not sure that this is either for me.
Yeah, so Wesley's point is very important here. We've gotten to using all sorts of terms to create categories of thinkers, of political actors, conservative, liberal. And Wesley's point is if we keep using them, these are actually abstract terms. Then that this is going to reinforce these differences. The piece that I found was useful about this slide from the Pew Research Center is the dramatic change from 2004 to 2017. Mm-hmm. And that's the piece that I just this is material that's out there, and it's a way of reflecting back. What does hyperpolarization look like? Joel's been waiting.
My immediate problem with this is that the meaning of the middle has changed dramatically. Changed dramatically in my lifetime. So, I mean, what constituted middle in the 1960s now looks wildly left-wing. So I'm not sure what this is exactly telling us. It could be that large numbers of people are staying exactly where they were, but other folks are moving more and more to the right.
Right. So Joel's point is that the politics are changing. What it means to be a person in the middle in 2019 looks very different than what a person in the middle in 1994 would look like. And the positions on the two sides, although it's interesting to see how, again, I'm not a real social scientist. I just read old books. I have ideas. I don't want to make any claims about this. I thought the trend was interesting, but this key point that these may not be at all useful because the political background has changed a lot. We're not even talking about these in the same way. I'm going to keep moving that if you don't mind, and just I want to get a few more things out there, and then we're going to open it up. So this is something that just appeared in the Atlantic. They asked PredictWise, a polling and analytics firm, to create a ranking of counties in the U.S. based on partisan prejudice, or what researchers call effective polarization. I'm going to zoom in on some of that. New York State is so fascinating to me. So if the darker it is, means that there's more animosity towards the other party. Doesn't say which party, but when there is more of a strong push for not trusting the other party, then the county will be a darker color.
It does say which party.
It says
Democrats. This is
Sorry, this is all Democrats. Sorry, okay, thank you. Yeah, so this one is showing Democrats' prejudice against Republicans. And I'm going to flip it to Republicans' prejudice against Democrats. And now I'm going to zoom in on a map that puts both of those two data together. This is the one together. Windham County, Vermont is in the 86th percentile, which means that 14 out of every 100 counties are more prejudiced against the political other.
What's the meaning of prejudice?
So a prejudice, so I guess this is surveys, data analytics, not an expert at all, but they did a whole bunch of questions about such things as, would you be willing to have your child marry somebody of another party? Would you be comfortable working for somebody of another party as a boss? Would you be willing to hire somebody of another party as an employee? That sort of thing. Also, they asked them things like, how often do you talk to somebody who's from another party? And Windham County comes out pretty strongly prejudiced. However, look at New York. Yes?
It says 14 out of every 100 counties. Should that read towns or people?
It's by county.
It says Windham County.
Yeah.
Is in the 86th percentile, which means that 14 out of that, the second half of the sentence seems to refer back to Windham County.
14 out of every 100 people.
People or...
Well, this I didn't type. This is exactly how it appeared on the thing. So this is how I'm understanding it. And that is that it's in the 86th percentile county by county. So if you take 100... So if you take all the counties in the United States and then think about them in terms of percentages, that means our baseline is 100 counties. Not 100 counties in Vermont. It's just that within all the counties of the entire country, including Hawaii, that they then rank them in terms of percentages. And we were at 14. 14 out of 100. Does that make sense? So we are in the 86th percentile, which means that we are fairly prejudiced We're not in the 100th percentile. We are in the 86th percentile. And this is one of those things where ideally you probably don't want to have a high percentage. That's what I'm guessing. It's not like school. But we are quite a bit more prejudiced in Windham County than, oh my God, look at the state of New York. What is happening in the state of New York? Somehow Democrats and Republicans are intermarrying there. That's what this suggests. And it's not happening much here. Yeah, Thad, yeah.
Let me define in psychology one of the big studies. You can look this up in the New York Times science section. If like me, you have science on the New York Times online, you can go all the way back to the report on that. And that was that description of which is stronger, the conscious or the subconscious mind. They did tests. I'm not going to tell you how they put people in the subconscious and conscious mind, but they discovered that people were much, much more intelligent on the subconscious level than they were on the conscious level. They tested students and they didn't do anything. They offered college professors to try to beat themselves. And they offered them $200 and they couldn't do it. So
Thad, I'm just going to stop you for a second.
End there.
Yeah.
Hold on one thing. President Nixon was able to predict the outcome of elections all the time. And the reason why was because he understood people's prejudices.
Okay. So Thad is saying that if you understand people's prejudices, then you are better able to predict elections. And Thad is saying that Nixon had this. But Thad, the piece I don't understand is how does that pertain to, and I'm sure you're onto something, but you're wanting us to see the difference between the conscious mind and the unconscious mind. And let me just offer something and then you tell me if I'm on the right path, is that consciously we may not be very aware of our partisan prejudices, but unconsciously we may have all sorts of things happening.
In order to receive information and lock it not into your short-term memory but your long-term memory, you obviously have to be prejudiced towards learning it. So that's the point, is we lock it into our long-term memory and then we take that map and apply it to other things.
And I'm going to stop you there just because we're moving a little bit off into other things. But this idea that, I wanted to offer this idea of, again, you can completely say this data is wrong or the procedure was wrong, and I will not at all be able to claim otherwise. But isn't it interesting to note in yourself the response that you are having right now to know that the Atlantic magazine has positioned our county, unlike the county in New York, as much more prejudiced? And then to just hold on to that. Again, this is what we're doing here, is getting information and then trying to make sense of it and seeing how it squares with our self-image. Lynn.
I think, though, and I could be wrong, that if you would have done that like 20 years ago, 25 years ago, that would not have been.
So Lynn is suggesting that if we did this, if the data analytics people had come in and done this, it would not have looked like that 25 years ago in Vermont. And
I don't think so, because I can remember people saying, well, he's Republican, and I don't agree with him, but...
Because Lynn can remember, not that long ago, so-and-so is a Republican, but I actually agree with him. And we have been, actually, we're a kind of interesting state, because we often do vote in Republican governors. So that's kind of interesting. We're a little confused, it suggests. Let's go to if we accept the fact that we've got a problem, right? That's the first step. Step number 1, came to realize I had a problem with cognitive dissonance. And the Democratic theorist, unlike the 12-step program, says you need accurate information. Is that really going to solve it? I'm giving these lovely political scientists a bit of a hard time here because this has been the standard explanation of how to deal with the problem. Give people accurate information. Have opportunities for public deliberation. And engage in mutual respect. I still believe in this, but it's not enough. So here we're going to hold on to some very good ideas on how to deliberate because it creates more legitimacy, it promotes good civil values, So all of that is very, very helpful. However, we also have to pay attention to the human brain and its strange ways and the feeling beasts that we all are. So for cognitive psychology, the suggestion is, and we'll go back to that idea, stay with the mistake. But what does that really look like? Stay with the mistake. Here's a picture from the 2007 massacre in Baghdad with the Blackwater security forces who gunned down 14 people. In Nisour Square, there is an Iraqi policeman really looking at what happened. This is an example where the harm was chronicled, and it eventually took a long time, went to trial, a very long time, but eventually 4 of the guards were later found guilty of killing 14 people and injuring 17 others. And to me, that is a moment where, yes, the harm was recognized, yes, an entire operation was given a lot of scrutiny, and yes, eventually justice did win out. Again, I'm not being naive. I'm not saying that justice always wins out, but I am suggesting that this is what staying with the mistake can look like. And that's when we need the justice system. The other piece is to notice in ourselves, when we're dealing with cognitive dissonance, to notice the self-justifications. How it is we made sense to ourselves if we have done something and then the outcome is so horrific. And boy, right now, human beings are capable to do such destruction. So then, how do we actually stay with these mistakes? And but here's a new term. Carolyn, during the break, said, I think what we need is courage in order to do this work. And I think that's absolutely right. And here's something else. We need to practice self-compassion. Because all that shame that we were talking about and how that can be isolating, especially if it's feeling like a punitive shame, that feeling, I gather from the cognitive science, is going to intensify the need for self-justification in order to reduce that pain. But if we engage in self-compassion, that's the big one. Then we should have a chance of beginning to correct cognitive dissonance. They make, you'll get this in the second edition, not in the first edition. The road to redemption starts with, actually, would somebody like to read that? Yeah, Peter, you want to read this?
No,
Or you want to ask a question? Yeah.
I'm not understanding what stay with the mistake means.
So when we've had something a specific incident, now the piece here is to move off of abstract thinkings. So-and-so is terrible, or, this is how it often works, I am a horrible person. So if I stay with the mistake, if I'll take you through the driving exercise, why was I going so fast? Because I didn't leave the house on time. Why didn't I give myself enough time? Because I was nervous about what I was about to go to, and I was very worried about what I was what I was wearing. So how much time did I spend then on my outfit, forgetting what it is that I actually needed to do? And I begin to see these little places where I make mistakes. So staying with the mistake, you have to get out of, I'm a good person and there are bad people, to what am I actually doing? What made me do this? Or what made that happen in Baghdad? Out of the abstract into the very concrete.
Okay, so it doesn't mean continuing to make the same mistake over and over again, even though it's not in your best interest.
So Peter's asking, doesn't mean continuing to make the same mistake over and over again. And Peter just said something really important. Because it is in your best interest to make the mistake, or because it is not in your best? It is not in your best interest to make the mistake.
But some people are very stubborn and they keep making the mistake.
I know, and it's always so interesting. We're going to do a lot of this. Some people are very stubborn. And we're going to say there's a lot of people who don't want to hear the truth. And what we're actually being asked to do is to move to that third dimension that Susan Hesse brought to our attention and say, okay, when am I stubborn? And then to have compassion for ourselves and our stubbornness as part of our disposition to going into good clash. This is all our psychological cleanup operation in order to go into good clash. So we have to do a whole lot of self-forgiveness before we talk to somebody who doesn't agree with us. We do not have to, Myra, yes?
But that means giving up your core.
And Myra says, if you have self-compassion, notice what you just said, Myra. You're going to be so interested about this when I reflect it back to you. Myra just said, I think, that when you engage in this process, you're going to have to give up a core of your self-belief. And I think Myra is absolutely right. And that is why self-compassion, if we follow the psychologists, may be so necessary, because maybe your core turns out to be, it's like my whole I'm such a safe driver. I may have to have some compassion and say, well, I don't always make good decisions if I'm spending too much time on my outfit. If I'm worried too much about my outfit, I don't give myself enough time. And I got to give myself some self-compassion there in order to actually learn and change my behavior. I think the 12 steps have figured this out. Yeah, Steve.
I keep feeling that there's another layer, for me it's below that, which is embedded in what you're talking about, which is some understanding of our assumption that pain is a bad thing. And maybe pain isn't a bad thing. And if pain is not necessarily a bad thing, it's not so hard to have self-compassion or any of these other steps. Yes. But there's an assumption that pain is bad.
Yeah, right. So Steve just said, if the underlying assumption is that pain is a bad thing, and cognitive dissonance gives us pain, and then we do self-justification to get out of that pain. But what if we just take that step that Steve says, that the pain is not a bad thing? And maybe there, like self-compassion, pain, I don't know. But I feel like it's an enormous piece, is to say, life is painful. That's it.
That's how you learn.
That's how you learn. It doesn't mean, though, that then we get stuck in self-hatred, because that's not going to help us. Does somebody want to read this quote from the need, Under the Need for Self-Compassion?
The road to redemption starts with the understanding that who we are includes what we have done, but also transcends it. The vehicle for transcending it is self-compassion.
Yeah. So we talked about this last time, too, the difference between the act and the actor. The generative process says that we are evolving beings. We are becoming in relationship to each other. If we completely focus on the act, so if I completely obsess with what's the matter with me, that I can't be thinking about how much time it takes to get somewhere, and I spend way too much time frantically in my closet, that I have to really own that about myself and say, I am more than that. Because yes, I may flaunt my PhD, but I'm also going to flaunt the clothes. That's how I roll. And I got to understand that it's a problem for me. Really, I can go the 12 steps on this one. I'm going to do a moral inventory about how many times I've been late because I spent way too much time on my outfit. And therefore made bad decisions. But that's kind of the piece. Yeah, Janice.
I get that. I just find it a lot, I feel the conversations are on another plane.
Yeah.
When you're grappling with the value like, I can't accept war at all.
Yeah.
I think all guns are bad, or I believe in the sanctity of human life to the extent that I can't, I want to respect a person, but those to me are such core. If you're asking people to give up our core, where is it? It's a different core than I'm vain or
Right. Yeah, so Janice is saying, like, I mean, and to a certain degree, I'm using this very easy example. And I know there's a hand in the back. I'm sorry, I just saw you because you guys were in the dark, but I'll go to you next. That the idea of what are we going to do when the situation is so big that our core belief is being challenged. So what would it look like? For me, the example is living in Halifax during the Take Back Vermont movement. It was when the state legislature was wanting to pass civil union, and there was a strong backlash where people had Take Back Vermont. And the people who were, so I lived in Halifax with my partner, Allison, and we had our 2 kids. And the guy on the other side of the river was very, very strong on the Take Back Vermont campaign. He had gone to Montpelier and he created a platform. This is not going to be as strong as when we get into life and death issues, but it has a lot to do with very basic core beliefs. And so anyway, he created a pamphlet, and as part of his pamphlet, which was all about the need to take back Vermont, he wrote a little story. And the story was about how one day in September, he and his daughter were driving by our house and they noticed there were all these people there, and we were doing a ceremony. And he turned to his daughter and he said, "Do you think the girls are getting hitched?" And the daughter said, "Yes." He put that story in his pamphlet that was also about the need to take back Vermont and not have civil union. He also put in, and this is how human beings just amaze me, a piece that I had written, I don't know, 6 months earlier called Take Back the Queers. What was the matter with my people? We all wanted to become bourgeoisie. That this was not the gay movement I signed up for. We were supposed to be having colorful parades, saying all sorts of obscene things in public, and that was what it meant to be a true queer. So why were we going down the marriage road? So he put that in the pamphlet too. What an interesting mix. Sometimes I think core beliefs are actually, I don't know. You know, I mean, we want to say we're completely against war, and I'm not talking for anybody else. I am somebody who has a pretty strong Quaker background and certainly saw a lot of reasons in the 70s to be against war and went from door to door speaking out against Nixon and the Hanoi bombing. And then there were also moments after 9/11 when I found myself thinking that may be necessary. So I offer that in that my core beliefs got wobbly. And it's when we actually get down into the neighbors living next to each other and trying to make sense of each other that I think we could have a possibility of having these hard conversations. So and when we get into this is something Hobbes said, beware of moralizing in deliberation. We will be tempted to take the moral high ground. And we will say that anybody who speaks against us is doing something unlawful. This was Hobbes' concern. So yes, we may have strong beliefs, and it may be part of our core identity, and Hobbes, at least, would suggest turn down the volume on the morality. And try and get to much more specifics, much more specific details. I'm going to pull out I only have 2 more of these slides, and then we can open it up for conversation. I wrote this down from the book because it seemed to me that there was a lot in common between what Tavris and Aronson are saying and what Jane Addams said. So just to remind us for that, her understanding of the generative process, I see it as a disposition, a mindset. It reveals the thinking mind, not just the thought itself. So our core beliefs are part of a thinking mind, which means your position may change. She writes about a beloved friend of hers who was an adamant socialist. This is Chicago, 1900, who 5 years later was a little thinner and had become an adamant Buddhist. And she saw that as an example of how complex human beings can be. It wasn't as if the person had radically changed, but something deep inside had gone through a metamorphosis. Looks for the details of the human element. Like my neighbor who said, "Do you think my girls are getting hitched?" While we're doing our little we didn't do a civil union. I wasn't willing to do anything until I could get a tax benefit. That's the kind of person I am. But he looked at our ceremony that we had and wanted to note that. And it also works within a rhetoric of becoming, so that we understand that people may change their positions. And the final slide it starts to move us towards our next talk, which is going to be on abortion. So here's a picture. It's not unlike our couple doing this, back to back, hands on the ears. This is a particularly interesting story because Norma McCorvey, who was Roe, who is the woman who was used. I'm going to say was used because that's what lawyers do in the best way, right? If you want to bring a great case to the Supreme Court, you find a good case person. You find a good plaintiff. So Norma McCorvey fit all the criteria. We'll talk about this more next week. And then she switched sides. So she was a becoming person who went through all sorts of changes from being the poster child for abortion rights and then to being one of the biggest opponents of abortion rights. So how do we make sense of all that? So she's one of our people that we'll be looking at. Yeah, so I know I was pushing us through with some ideas. What kind of questions does this lay out? Yes, and can you tell, oh, that's Howard. Wait, sorry, Howard, before I turn to you, somebody has been very patient in the dark and I don't even know if it's a human being.
Hi, my name is Scott, and I thought I would just be cheeky.
Oh, good.
And just offer that as a minister, as a Christian minister in this season of Lent,
yes,
where one focuses on humility and introspection, that perhaps theologians had figured many of these things out before the political philosophers or the social scientists.
But all right, yes, I know your canon goes pretty far back. I get that. I think Aristotle was 300 BC, though. I'm just saying. So, but you want to say more, Scott, about what that ritual of Lent to you might offer? And I know I'm going to understand that not everybody's going to be following this, and other people may have other examples of rituals that allow for just this sort of reckoning. Do you want to say more, Scott?
Well, what sparked my desire to be a little bit cheeky was just your point about being self-compassionate, which requires one to be willing to admit mistakes and to forgive oneself for those mistakes.
Yeah.
And if we cannot do that, then we cannot move forward with anyone else.
Right.
So it was the self-compassion that triggered my desire to be cheeky.
Right. And cheeky, I don't know. Your whole thing about your guys are older than my guys, that may be a little bit cheeky. But this idea of a ritual that is part of a calendar in which that is allowed and encouraged and actually mandated could be something to pay attention. So the idea of atonement in the Jewish tradition. So, right, that atonement is going to be part of the mix. I love it that it's calendar-based. We can't always do this all the time, but we can give it special attention during certain times. Yeah. Howard, thanks for waiting.
Yeah, the prejudice in Vermont is like my wife saying I never changed my mind.
The prejudice in Vermont is like my wife saying, I never changed my mind. Do you care to elaborate? Yeah.
Are there metaphysical underpinnings? Is there truth? Is there moral and good and bad? Because if you start right,
yeah,
you better not change your mind.
Right. Oh my. So Howard says, this is the big question from last week too, is there a common interest? Is there a truth? Are there moral underpinnings? What do you think, Howard?
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Yeah, and you said that without hesitation. And so how do you deal with people who say they're right and they're never wrong when you have those sort of moral foundations?
I don't want to use that, but it's trivial, right? It's the medieval trivial.
And Howard is talking about the medieval trivial. Do you
So
want to?
there's logic and fact and
Yeah.
grammar.
Yeah.
But there's rhetoric. You can persuade people using all these human factors.
Right.
And then there's anybody's Hegel's dialectic, right? Which is, how do I take my thesis and his antithesis and
synthesize, yep.
something that lets us come together.
Yeah, so I think, the philosophical tradition, and I'm a big fan of the philosophical tradition, because we're looking for some sort of ground that we can stand on, and that the ground is going to be bigger than our differences, and that the whole is going to be bigger than even the aggregate of factions. I'm not doing this whole series on Spinoza, so I should probably not even start on Spinoza. But maybe someday you all will invite me back, and we will talk about how do we find God in a secular way using metaphysics, and I will offer you Spinoza. But the key piece about all of that is his way forward is we can only understand the truth about the circumstances we're in if we go through the feelings. And we have to really be paying attention to all our feelings. And then we have to be noticing how those feelings are affecting our thinking. And if we are feeling scared, our thinking is going to become more rigid. And it might even be moralistic. That's all from Spinoza. But if we are able to own our feelings, see how when we have disagreements with people, what kind of feelings come up, and then think about what happens when we actually understand each other. I understood my neighbor so much better, and his whole Take Back Vermont piece. It was like, yeah, go ahead, I don't mind. You saw me. I don't mind if you go out there and say you want to take back Vermont. Honestly, I felt encouraged that he saw me. And so my feelings changed about him. When I was afraid, because I saw the Take Back Vermont sign, we were not having good conversations. So that's the piece. It's metaphysics and a high degree of feelings. How about Lynn and then Peter Amidon? So first Lynn.
Well, I just wanted to share that sometimes you're giving the opportunity to, by staying with the mistake, to see the mistake. And the best example I ever saw was my father worked in New York City, so he had certain prejudices against people of another race.
Yeah.
And then I turned up one day with a 5-month-old African-American baby girl who's going to be his granddaughter. And he just went rigid. And I didn't see him for 3 months. And I know that he talked to friends that agreed with him about race. I know he talked to other people. All I know is he turned up at my door one day, 3 months or 4 months later, and said, I'm going to the store. I'm going to can I take the baby?
Wow. So did people hear Lynn's story? Yeah, okay, so Lynn's story is about her father, who, a lovely person, but very, very prejudiced, especially about people of different race. And Lynn has a daughter who's African American. And as a baby, African American baby. And when the father first saw the baby, he was entirely rigid. And for 3 months, there was no interaction. But after talking with people who may have been just as prejudiced as he was, or maybe other people, he came to the door one day and said, I'm going to the grocery store, can I take the baby? And so Lynn sees in this capacity for circumstances, the details of human life can be very powerful for changing people. And I'm going to turn it to Peter, and then I'll say goodbye.
I was just dying to know what your take on was of the visual that you had of the two mountains that were liberal and conservative, and then the next one that was more like a plateau, and why that turned into a plateau.
Yeah, and so Peter's asking about those 3 things from the Pew Research, and like, what changed? What made it all of a sudden move further out to the right? I don't know what's going on. For me, I tend to understand things using Spinoza through the affects, and I think that our feeling state has moved into such a level of fear or hope, which is also problematic for Spinoza. It gets our expectations up way too high. So if we think of the 2008 election, which was all about give hope a chance, and then the hope did not deliver in the same way, and then our fears will go up. We are ripe for manipulation right now. We don't even need Russian robots. We are just ripe for manipulation because our affects are so high. So to my mind, that means less people able to hold both positions. You can do that when you're feeling strong. You can do that when you're feeling reasonable. You can do that when you feel like, I know which way I think I feel, but I'm willing to hear this. When you're feeling filled with fear or hope, you can't. So this is go back to Howard's point, a reason for some reason. Yeah. Anyway, thank you very much, everybody.